Number two, question for the materialist is, what is the origin of life? What is the origin of life? Where does life come from? Now, we've talked about this the last couple weeks, but here is the problem. Use my marbles here. The marbles are not biological entities. They're matter. They're matter in motion. But they're not. This is not a biological thing that you can study because it's not living. The marbles are not alive. They're a non-living entity. So you have the product here of physics and chemistry. And I'm a biological entity that is also involved in physics and chemistry. But materialism has to assume, and here's the blank here, materialists must assume that the universal principle that life does not come from non-life. It's called the law of biogenesis, science. That materialists must assume that the universal principle that life does not come from non-life and the admittedly untrue view of spontaneous generation, that things come somewhere out of nowhere, those are two irrational and unscientific worldviews. Science rejects that life arises from non-life, law of biogenesis. Science currently also rejects spontaneous generation, that things generate out of nowhere for no reason, spontaneously. But if the materialistic world is true, it has to explain how you get life from non-life, how you get ethical, like moral beings like us who do try to tell a difference between right and wrong from non-moral substances, and how you get thinking from non-thinking material. Right? So, what is the origin of life, according to the materialist? And basically, they would have to engage in speculation, guessing. Now, they may say, I speculate because of things we've observed in the present and try to put them over the past, but that's something that won't work. And here's why. So, some questions. How did non-living physical and chemical processes in motion originate life? Even if I shake these marbles, even if I add chemicals, even if I add different things, it will not become something that it doesn't have the attributes to be. Life does not come from non-life. Even if I give a lot of time, even if I give millions of years, presumably, this stuff will not become non-life. Why? Because it doesn't have it's like if I get a box of cake mix, no matter how much I shake, reconfigure, do stuff with that box of cake mix, it will not become the Declaration of Independence. Because it doesn't have the materials in it to be the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't have they don't share attributes. So materialism has to assume, and so does naturalism, that things become their opposites. But so people would laugh at that, and rightly so, but they think Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, is a product of physical and chemical processes. So they recognize the foolishness of that with, marbles or cake mix don't become the Declaration of Independence, but physics, biology, and chemistry in motion don't become Thomas Jefferson, right? So that's a problem. Now, they may say, a materialist may object that it must have happened, at some point over millions of years. We don't know how necessarily, but it must have happened because here we are, right? But that's called question begging. That's circular reasoning. That's vicious, elementary circular reasoning, because it assumes what it wants to prove. It assumes that materialism and life originated from non-living material, something not observed and unscientific and illogical, and then it observes the presence of life and concludes that if life exists, it must have originated in the way that the materialist claims. So we're here, so my explanation of origins must be true. The Christian could say the same thing. Well, how do you know that the account in Genesis, in the Bible, of God's creation is true? Well, it must be true because here we are, right? You think a college professor would accept that in a biology or philosophy class? Well, Genesis 1 must be true because we're human beings who were created by God. Here we are. That's question begging. But when the materialist does it, engages in that, they don't always get called out. Well, evolution, materialism must be true. It must have created life somehow because here's life, right? Joel brought up, I think last week or previously, that some people think that they get so speculative. They say, well, life must have been planted here by aliens from some other planet or something. So it's like, okay, now we're in. I've had a conversation with some friends a few years ago where we talked about just that, and I said, well, now you guys were talking about how the biblical worldview is unscientific and that you reject it on that basis, but you're making up an explanation now. That's not scientific. So if we can just make things up, then why criticize the biblical worldview and say that you don't believe it's true, right? I mean, if we're just speculating and guessing. And then, so that idea that life originated from non-living material is irrational, is something that doesn't have the attributes of something. Things become their opposites. That's not true. It's illogical, doesn't match up with definitions, and it's unscientific. We don't observe that happening in the world, right? It's against scientific law. But it's the basis of materialistic philosophy. And if that's the basis of your philosophy, meaning everything else sits on top of it like the foundation, and it's illogical, unscientific, then that means your whole worldview is based on something that is illogical and unscientific, and according to materialist standards should be rejected. So, but sometimes they say, okay, well, maybe there was one exception. Yes, we know that generally life does not come from non-life, but maybe there was one exception to the rule, which the Christian could also say too, right? Well, maybe, the miracles, people don't usually rise from the dead. Maybe there's one exception, right? That wouldn't be good argumentation either, but they want to have one exception to universal rules, like logic and science. But they also want to tell us to be reasonable and scientific. But the point of having universal rules is that they're universal. They don't have exceptions, unless in science you observe something like that, but it hasn't been observed.
So that the problem with science is it theorizes and says this is a theory, it's not a fact, but it's a working theory. We're working on it.
Yeah, theory.
You buy into it on that basis.
Yeah, theory in science, usually in the scientific community, usually means a bit more than people give it credit. It means something that's been pretty well established. So they'll talk about, the theory of evolution, and sometimes Christians will say it's just a theory. Actually, Darwinian evolution is not a theory, it's a model. It's an approach to, this is how we try to give a mechanism to explain it. But most people don't know that, so yeah, but it is, they theorize, and you have to theorize. That's part of how you figure things out. But you have to theorize according to logic, right principles of thinking, and science. It's not, we don't speculate, okay, it must have been aliens, it's like, well, then you lose out on being objective.
What about models? Those are a problem too.
Yeah, well, let me talk for a second about my field of economics. Models, by definition, are inaccurate. I mean, they purport to have some mechanism that they explain something, but they can't explain everything because, stuff like economics or anything else is pretty complicated. But a lot of times people will build their model, and then when there's facts and things that contradict it, you have people writing in economics classes these complex mathematical equations on the board, and they'll say, but there's this problem with this, that's not how people behave in the world, that's not what we see. And then the person's like, well, I don't care, it doesn't match my model. My model says this is how it should be, so it tries to get around those things as well. So yeah, models, you need them. You have to apply a model of thought or theory somehow, but they're not definitive. So anyway, but the idea that there's one unique exception, means that a denial of scientific law and laws of logic. And it's still speculation. It's unobserved and it's irrational. And so science doesn't work by imagining exceptions to general principles. That's not how you work. You don't say, okay, imagine if gravity weren't true. Now, gravity is not, it's a law, but it's true with certain conditions, right? But if one exception is allowed to a universal principle, it's not universal. So one time, life became non-life, and therefore here we are. Number one, that's not seen, observed in any scientific way, and there's no reason to expect that exception happened. Bahnsen, again, a quote from him, he says, "We see the absurdity of the atheistic materialistic worldview, and that they have qualities coming from their opposites. Life coming from non-life, moral coming from the non-moral, the intelligent coming from the unintelligent." Right? So just like my marbles here, non-living, non-moral, non-intelligent, that enough movement and time and physics and biology and chemistry in motion that they can become their opposites. But things do not, by reconfiguration, become their opposites. No matter how much you mix with the box of cake mix, it doesn't become either the Declaration of Independence or Thomas Jefferson. And so the materialistic worldview can't satisfactorily answer the question of what is the origin of life on its own terms. Right? It has to abandon what it believes, or it has to get into thinking that is irrational and unscientific.